Cool. Well, thanks everyone for attending today's webinar. Again, my name is Richard Funnell. I am the Global Training Specialist at Luxion, makers of KeyShot. So today we're going to be going over some of the essentials. Today we're going to be focusing on KeyShot 4, but all of this is going to be carrying over to our impending release of KeyShot 5 as well. I'll try to call anything out that's going to be vastly different, but for the most part, this is going to be a good solid introduction to everything you need to know about the essentials in KeyShot. Starting from importing to working with textures and materials, things like that, and then getting into things like render settings, environments, cameras, some of your real-time settings, things like that. All right. So this is the window as it basically pops up when you start KeyShot. So I'll just go ahead and click that and get that out of the way. I've got my KeyShot library on the left, my project window on the right. You can toggle these just by hitting these buttons here. We'll be using some keyboard shortcuts as we go on today. And if I use them, I'll try to call them out. You always know that you can hit the K key on your keyboard. And this is on Windows and Mac. It's going to bring up the list of the KeyShot hotkeys. So that's just K, hit that, and you can always see the hotkeys quickly. So for example, one handy hotkey that you can always use under render, you can get to it here, but you can always pause real-time render. You can get there by hitting Shift P. But for example, if you want to be able to work in whatever your 3D modeling application is, or Creative Suite, or whatever, if you just want to pause KeyShot, you can always do that just by hitting Shift P. So to get started, we're just going to go ahead and we're going to import a model. So let me find a model that I've got here. Just as reference, if you use this drop down here, you can see a list of all the file types that are accepted by KeyShot. So this list at the top here are all the native file types that we take. So everything from Inventor to Solid Edge, SketchUp, Rhino, you can see the list there, as well as the common exchange formats here. So we do have a pretty comprehensive list, and we're working on adding, more native file types. But otherwise, there's a really good chance that your software can output to one of these file types here. And I'll go ahead and just select this camera. So this is an NX assembly. That's what I'm going to be working with, and I'm going to go ahead and hit open. Okay, so when you first start KeyShot, these settings may be hidden, right? So I just want to talk a little bit about actually importing here. So by default, this is what it's going to look like. Any file that comes into KeyShot is going to be centered, it's going to be snapped to ground, and the sizing is going to be automatic. What that means is that whatever your model is going to scale up or down to fit the KeyShot environment. That's okay if you're working just as kind of a one-off. Let's say you bring a part into KeyShot and you're just going to do that rendering and that's it. But let's say you're going to bring in multiple variations of a part, or more parts in that assembly. If you've ever run into the issue where those parts come in and they might be a different scale or in the wrong location or something like that, the recommendation that I would give you is to work with keeping the original. This way, it's actually going to keep the original location from your modeling software, as well as the size or the scale. That way, that's the easy way of bringing the parts in and have them actually respect the original size. This up orientation here is pretty important as well. This is going to be defined differently in different 3D packages. For example, NX, I know this Z is going to be up, but if we're working in, say, Rhino, then I'd use Y as the up orientation. So if you've ever imported a part and it's turned 90 degrees and you don't know why that's happening, it has to do with defining your up orientation here. And as long as you set that, KeyShot's going to remember it every single time. So that's just a quick way of knowing what's up as far as bringing your model in. In this case, NX gives me a tessellation slider here. So by sliding this to the right, you'll see this with different importers that you bring in depending on the file type. If I crank this value up, then it's going to give me a higher quality mesh, but I'll just keep this at a default of 0.2. One thing to also keep in mind, that tessellation slider, if you push that over, it's going to take longer for the file to actually import, and it'll generate a larger file size, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to make it take longer to actually render. So if you're running into issues where your geometry isn't refined enough, you can move this tessellation slider and you don't have to worry about it taking longer to actually import these parts. Or excuse me, it won't take longer to render. I'll go ahead and import that, and KeyShot's going to do its thing, and it's going to bring in that assembly with all of the all the assemblies, sub-assemblies, all the parts that you can see here under my scene tree, right? So let's talk really briefly as well. So you can always import basically any file manually, but what about actually using our plugins? I'm going to pause my real-time window here, and I'm just going to tab over. Let me see if I can change the screen here really quickly. I just want to call out the fact that we do have plugins. So these are available for the list you can see here. So SolidWorks, SketchUp, Creo, Pro-E, Rhino. We also have some third-party plugins as well, and we're working on making this list a little bit bigger. So the nice thing about these plugins is that they'll actually take care of all those import settings for you. So instead of having to juggle that kind of stuff, it can be done directly with the plugin. So I'll just pull up a quick example of that. Here I've got this SolidWorks assembly. So I've got these two parts and this fan. And if you're working with the plugin, which is free, it does give you a KeyShot button here. So if I go ahead and click that and I were to hit render, then it's actually going to import that directly into KeyShot, and it's going to take care of all the orientation and the scaling and everything like that. So you can see that now my part is inside of KeyShot, and I didn't have to actually import that. It's done through the plugin. So now when I, let's say, drag some materials on here, we'll see that applied. The nice thing about the plugins is that some of the plugins are live linking as well. So again, I'll just pause at Shift P. So if I go back into SolidWorks and I decide to make changes to anything here, so for example, let me increase the number of blades and then just go ahead and regenerate that. So now we have 13 blades instead of the 7. Now I can go back up to the KeyShot menu here for my plugin. Now when I hit update, it's going to push these changes directly over to KeyShot. So now you can see that now I have the updated geometry, it retained my materials. But if you're not using the plugins, it is good to know that you have those available. Again, they're free, and you can just use those to take care of all the importing for working with KeyShot. All right, so I'll go ahead and close this down, just because I am going to be working back on the Mac side over here. But I did want to show you a little bit of that functionality and how that's going to work. So let me toggle over to my main screen. All right, so hopefully that shows just fine, and I'm going to unpause my real-time view again just by hitting Shift P. All right, so now we've got this basically in our startup environment, right? So all of our lighting is going to be coming from our spherical environment. You'll see that when I kind of zoom out and rotate the camera. Because this was modeled in NX with the center point of the geometry as my 0, 0, 0 origin point, you can see it's actually intersecting the ground plane there. So what I can do is I can just select that entire camera, go to my position tab, and just snap that to the ground. So now it's going to be snapped to my ground plane inside of KeyShot. If I zoom in and out, or dolly in and out, you can see that the camera is still set to the old center point, right? So what I can do is I can just right click, I can look at the object center, and now the camera is going to be rotating around my new center point. Let's go ahead and talk about actually applying some of the materials that you can see here. One thing I do want to call out as well is under my settings, I can toggle back and forth between performance and quality. Sometimes this advanced tab it hasn't been expanded, so I'll just expand that. But if I toggle back and forth, you'll see that I get this little P in the top right corner. When it's in performance mode, what it's doing, it's cutting down the ray bounces, turning off all the shadows, just so it's going to be a little bit more efficient way to run. So when you're just going in and kind of painting up your model and applying materials and things like that, performance mode is a really good way to work. All right, so let's take a look at some of the materials here in our material library. We have, I don't know what the current count is, but I think it was 700 or 800 different types of materials last time I checked. I saw that comment about zooming in and out, so I'll try to keep from zooming around too much. Okay, so our materials are broken up by the material type. So we've got some special materials in here, for example, like our Axalta paints, which were previously DuPont. They're nice because they're pre-made paint materials, so you can just drag these over. If you're ever working with any material and you drag it over, if you hover, if you don't let go of that material before you apply it, you'll see a preview of it actually being applied there. So for example, the Axalta paints, we have a sampler of the hot hues, but But if you go on our website, you can download more colors, for example, a full set of their popular colors, more of their Spectrum Master colors, and then some trending colors and things like that. So that's available on the KeyShot website. Additionally, we also have mold tech materials as well. So any of you that are using mold tech materials, you can just grab these, drag these over onto your part. And as long as you actually, when we imported, we had that to respect the original units, you'll see here that the representation of that mold tech texture is going to be accurate for the actual scale. So if I select my model here, you can see the units are set to millimeters. So this mold tech texture is actually going to be accurate. And again, you can always download more of these mold tech textures on our website. With KeyShot 4, we included the mold tech textures, but it is just kind of a sampler pack. Additionally, we also have some more materials that we've added with later versions of KeyShot 4, 4.2, 4.3, for example, like these scratch materials. So if I drag this material over, you'll see that it's a little bit more of an advanced material. It's generated by one of our users. But I show this to call out the fact that if you're missing some of these materials or environments that you see me using today, it's because you should try to run the full installer when you can. The update installer doesn't include all of the extra assets we've added to the library. So if you are missing, for example, this folder full of scratch metals or some of the environments that I'll be talking about later, make sure you run the full installer. Okay, so applying materials is easy as just dragging and dropping out of your library. So for example, we've got these lenses here, so I can just go in and grab a glass and drag it over. When we start talking about, let's say, this camera body here, I can go into my anodized metal folder and just get a rough anodized look, drag that over to that material. Okay, so as far as actually applying materials, if I were to drag another version of that material or that same material sphere over to this other part, and I double click it, and let's say we change the color, you'll notice that those parts aren't linked at all. So there's no association between those different parts inside my KeyShot scene. In order to actually link these materials, what we can do is we can just right click on the material we want to basically copy. And what we'll do is we'll hit select material. And then let's say I want to apply that material to this part here. I can just right click and I can apply the selected material. What that will do is that'll actually link those two parts. So it's going to be the same material on both of those parts. The shortcut for that on both Windows and Mac is Shift left click is copy, Shift right click is paste. So now when I double click on that material and make a change to the color, it's going to make a change on all of those. So those three materials are linked. There are a couple other different ways that we can assign materials as well. As you can see here, I have this material folder. These are all the materials that are inside this session of KeyShot. This is different from your actual KeyShot library, and that this is all the materials that I've already come in with. So in this case, it pulled some of those names from the actual parts as well as the RGB values. So for example, I've got parts that, let me see, it's these screws. They came in just with the diffuse white material. So I could go over here into my library. Let's take a look at some of these metals. Let's grab a chrome material. And if I just drag that onto that actual screw, it's going to update the colors there, or excuse me, the materials on all those parts, and I can just do that directly. You can also drag an actual material onto the actual name over here, and it'll update the material that way as well. All right, so let's just keep on adding some more of these materials. Oh, so here, I'll show you an example of that. So I have this assembly for the buttons. What I can do is I can grab this material, drag it over directly onto the name there, and even though it's got sub parts, all those parts are going to have that material assigned to them. And again, I can copy and paste materials. Shift left click is going to be copy, shift right click is going to be paste. And then I'll just finish adding up some more materials here. So for example, adding some color density for my little sensors or lenses, whatever they are here. Got these kind of a plastic ring there for our LED. So we'll just go to our plastics, hard plastics, and find a shiny white plastic and apply that. Oh, applied it to the wrong part. So I'll just undo that material assignment, drag that over, make sure I've got it on the right one, and then release it. And then go back and just pick up a couple of these parts that still need some material assignment to them. Okay, if I click on any part, you're going to see that highlighted in orange in my real-time view. So I can just uncheck that, right? And so now I can get to the parts that were below my piece of glass. Because if I turn that piece of glass back on, and let's say I go back to my plastic and let's find something that's a little bit rough, if I drag that over, even though that's a piece of glass, I can't actually apply it through that glass. It just sees that as transparency. So in this case, I'll just select that lens and then grab that material and apply it that way. It looks like these parts were actually linked as far as materials went inside of NX where this was modeled. So even though these are separate components, they're being assigned the same material because they were the same color within NX. So that's how it's going to be respected. It will respect the assemblies, sub-assemblies, and the things that are the same color or in the same part. It's going to have those as the same material. With Rhino, it's going to be working with layers, and then inside those layers, different colors. It's going to depend on your modeling software, but generally separate bodies are going to be respected as well as any different colors you want to make. So for example, on this camera, if I wanted to make this chamfer a different material, then inside NX, I would select these surfaces, apply a different material, and that would be respected when I brought it into KeyShot, and I could give that a different material. So I'll go ahead and right click. We'll show all parts just to bring those back. And let's talk a little bit about color. So if you've seen before, here in the library, we have the materials, but we also have colors. It's important to note this because the colors are actually going to be different from the material properties themselves. So for example, if I double click on this anodized rough gray metal, I can still drag a color onto that metal, right? So let's grab this blue, and you'll see that it still keeps the material properties. However, my color has been differentiated. So what you can do is actually just use this to apply the colors. What's nice about that is you can use the same color and apply it to different material types, and then those colors are going to be accurately represented for that material type on screen. So that's really important to know. So if we wanted to change color, we could also do that manually. If we want to assign the material, we can do that using Pantone and RAL definitions as well. So if you're actually giving someone a material or a color definition using a Pantone book, we can do that just by grabbing any of these colors here. Let's look for something like gray. I'm going to expand this window. I can also just type in gray, and you'll see within that directory it's going to search for anything that's kind of a gray tone. Now I can drag that over. And that Pantone color, this specific Pantone color, is going to be applied on that material. Right, so that's good to know. If you didn't know, that's how you can work with the different colors. You can also work with saved colors. So you can save a bunch of colors here, just using this little floppy disk icon, or you can save colors down here to your color palette. You can also, if I drag this window out of the way, I can use the eyedropper tool to actually pull colors from off screen. So if you want to try to match a color off of a website or a picture or an Illustrator file, for example, you can use the eyedropper that way. You can also use the eyedropper tool as well to actually match a Pantone color. So you have a lot of different options, and something we did add with KeyShot 4 was the ability to work with color calibration as well, so we do respect color profiles. All right, so let's talk about a little bit about making our own kind of custom materials and textures and things like that. So I'm just going to throw this into a slightly different environment, one that's got a little bit more contrast to it. So if I zoom out, you'll see that it's this 3 panels environment there, so we'll get some more kind of sharp reflections. Okay, so we'll go back to our materials here. And I'm just gonna go back into my plastics hard, and I'm just gonna get a shiny plastic, drag that over, and we'll replace that Mold-Tec texture that we had been working with, right? So if I double click on this material, it's gonna be editing it here under my material tab. And here are some of the basic parameters that we can work with inside of this material. So the diffuse color is going to be the base color of the material itself, right? So let's just change our color definition, something like RGB. So whatever color you assign this as is just going to be the actual material color, right? We'll set that back to black. The specular color is the color of light that's reflected off of that material. And specular is a really good term to know. This will pop up in a couple other places, so that's one that you should at least know what it is. Right now our specular color is set to white, right? So that's actually reflecting all the light that's coming off of that material. So if I change that color, for example, if I set that to black, then it's going to be a totally diffuse material. So we can really define how much light is being cast off that material by, working with the grayscale values. If you wanted to make a material that only reflected red light, you could do that by changing the specular color to red or any other color you want as well. So instead of messing with, say, like the roughness slider or adding something like a little bit of texture, you can adjust how much light is actually reflected off that material just by adjusting the specular color. So we'll set that back to a pure white. So that means that material is going to reflect all light, so white light, any light that's reflected, just by the specular color. And we didn't touch the roughness slider or anything like that. If we do mess with the roughness slider here, you'll see it's going to affect our reflections there. This actually isn't doing anything to the surface texture. The surface texture, we'll talk about adding texture there, but what this roughness slider does is it actually randomizes the way the light bounces off of this particular surface. So the light generally bounces, it hits a surface and then it bounces back at an inverse angle. All this slider is doing is actually randomizing that. So it's not actually adding texture, and we'll talk about how to give a surface a little bit kind of a rough texture, but I just want to make that clear. This isn't really giving you any texture. You still have a smooth surface, and I'll show you later how we can work with surface textures. So I'll right click, and I can always hit look at here, and then wherever you hit look at is going to be the focal point and the rotation point for that material, right? Let's also take a look quickly over here at our drop down, because working with a plastic material, how can we start making our own kind of custom plastics? I'm going to get out of performance mode by hitting Alt-P just so we can start seeing through this material a little bit more, but we can talk briefly about our transmission values here. So for example, specular transmission. This is going to be the color of light. For transmission values, it's the color of light that actually goes through a material. When it's set to black, there's going to be no light that travels through. But as I increase that to a pure white, you'll see that now I can actually start looking through this plastic material because I've adjusted my specular transmission. So if you want to make it like a gray plastic, you can do that and just go in and start customizing the look of your, you can start customizing the look of your plastic that way. If you wanted to make like a really deep plastic as well for color, now we can just set it so only red light is pushing through that. So now we get almost like a ruby type plastic, right? So that's how you can start working with your own kind of custom clear plastics. That's important too, because as you'll notice when you're working with KeyShot, the lighting is going to make a big difference on how that material is perceived in your scene. So knowing what these values mean is going to help you a lot as far as actually getting the right look for your material. All right, so we'll set that back to black. I do want to show briefly also how you can actually make a cloudy plastic. We have a quick tip on this, and I know it's been touched on before, but I do want to make sure that it's something we cover it. I'm going to make sure that we change this to our advanced material type. So we'll still have it as diffuse black. The diffuse color is black. Specular is set to white, right? So we still have a perfectly shiny material, and we have those same kind of transmission values here. What I'll do is I'll change the specular transmission so we have a clear material, right? But something that the advanced material gives you is the roughness transmission slider. So if I start moving that, that's actually going to give me some randomness in the way the light actually goes through the material. So now you can see that I still have my nice sharp glossy highlights, but now I'm adding roughness on the interior of that material. So you can see right here, I'm still getting my nice highlight, but it's going to create kind of that cloudy plastic or that milky look, which is sometimes difficult to get. A question about zooming in and out so fast. Sorry, basic camera control is just using the scroll wheel. So that's one way that you can zoom in and out. So if you don't have a 3-button mouse, I'd highly recommend working with a 3-button mouse, just because it does offer a lot easier interaction with the camera. Also, for example, with the 3-button mouse, if you hold down the middle button, you can pan a lot easier. So that's how that interaction is going there. But I'll change that back to just a hard shiny black plastic. But again, that's working with the roughness transmission with the advanced material type. So how do you actually work with creating your own, for example, wood or stainless steel or things like that? That's going to be working off of our textures here. So what we can do is we can go into our textures library here in the KeyShot library, and we have a bunch of different textures here that we can use as a starting point for this. You can use any image texture for this. So what I'll do is I'll just drag over. I'm going to grab this walnut texture and I'm going to drag that over and I'm going to apply that as a color texture. So you'll see this hard shiny plastic. It's still shiny, right? So I'm still getting these reflections along the body of that camera. But what it's done, and you can see here, is it replaced the diffuse color with whatever image texture I've used here. You can use any images for this as well. So it could be JPEG, as long as it's a raster image, JPEG, GIF, TIFF, PNG. You can bring those over to work with your own kind of custom materials. So once I've actually applied that texture onto this material, I can use my my mapping tool here, and I can start placing that however I want in the scene here, right? So I can go in and I can rotate it to place it exactly how I want it, do whatever I need to do with that image texture. I can also change the scale. So for example, knock that down to 0.5. You can start playing with how that texture is actually going to be placed and wrapped onto that object. We do offer a couple of different types of projection as well. So if you're working with UV coordinates, you would just select that here. But let's say you were going to be mapping it onto a texture onto like a bottle, let's say a soda bottle. Then you can use cylindrical projection to actually wrap that to the cylinder. But yes, this is going to replace whatever diffuse color you had before with the image information. So how do you get more realistic textures? You get more realistic textures by starting work with a combination of different texture types. So what I can do here is I can just drag this color texture over to this bump well right there. So once that reses up, you'll see that my diffuse color is back to being black. So it's still black shiny plastic. But now what I've done is I've used this image as a bump texture. So a bump texture will take the grayscale values, white being the highest, black being the lowest, to actually deflect the way the light is being cast onto this surface, right? So now you can see that wood grain is going to be visible and it's going to catch highlights and shadows differently than it did before. And this isn't actually modifying your 3D data at all. This is just changing the way the light bounces off of your surfaces. And again, here I can type in a different scale. So you can start working with using any image as a bump texture, and that'll help enhance the realism as well. And like I mentioned, the best way to get more realism out of your texture is to work with a combination of these textures. So if I hold down Option on the Mac or Alt on the Windows side, I can drag this image texture from bump over to color. And now you can see it's not as smooth and shiny as it was before, because I'm using the same image for both the color and the bump. So I'll toggle that on and off. So here you can see my perfectly smooth piece of wood. And then when I have that bump applied, now you can see I'm getting a lot more texture on that material there. The important slider to know for the bump texture is going to be this bump height here. So if you decrease the bump height, then it's going to make that difference between the tall and or the high and the low values smaller. If you push it too far, it'll start to get a little bit weird just because it doesn't necessarily know what's going on with that. I also want to call out that, let's say we're going to go ahead and get rid of our color texture and our bump texture. We do support normal maps. So normal maps are similar to bump maps in that they change basically the way the light bounces off the surface, but they're going to be these kind of bluish purple ones over here. And the difference with the normal map is that it also includes angular information. So if I drag that over and apply it as a bump, also got that as a color. But if I apply that as a bump, you're not going to see much difference there, right? The reason being, KeyShot will take that normal map and it doesn't know it's a normal map, so it tries to interpret it as a bump map. So if you're using a normal map, you just want to make sure that you check this box here, and then now you can see you're going to get more information using those normal maps. So I would just scale this down to a smaller value. And without actually having to model any of that detail in, you can see I'm getting a pretty distinct appearance here, and that's using that normal map. There's a question about an online library to share materials. That's going to be coming in KeyShot 5. About a couple of weeks back, we gave a demonstration of some of those new features. For now, we're calling it the KeyShot Cloud, and that's going to be built into KeyShot 5. So as far as getting more textures, materials, environments, and backplates, that functionality is coming in the future. So that's going to be pretty cool. Keep an eye out for that with KeyShot 5, the KeyShot Cloud. But yeah, so that's going to be working with normal maps. We also do support specular maps and opacity maps. I'll show the opacity map because I think that's going to be a really valuable one, kind of an essential thing to know. Let's say we wanted to work with some kind of grid pattern, but we don't want to actually model that out. What I'm going to do is I'm going to select this outer piece of glass. I'm going to unleak this material. So I'm working with one instance, and I'm going to change that from glass. Let's change that to something like, well, we'll use our blue plastic here. This is going to look weird, but it's going to make sense, I promise. But let's say we wanted to actually create a mesh there. In this case, what you could do is you can use an image texture. I'll double click on that, go over to our textures, and I can find a black and white image. So this is in the KeyShot library, Mesh Circular Alpha, and I'm going to apply that as an opacity map, right? So you'll see what happens here is the black and white image is actually going to represent visibility and invisibility on this material. So now in this image, anything that's white is going to be visible and anything that's black is going to be invisible. So we can use opacity maps to do things like meshes or filters or things like that. There are a bunch of different ways to use this, but what's nice about that is all you need are the black and white values. So if I drag over a different one, and you can use for example, you can build these in Illustrator or Photoshop or whatever image editor you want, but as long as it's a black and white image, we can see through that glass, and that way we can save ourselves some time from actually having to model that kind of detail, because that would be time intensive and it's going to add on to the complexity of our geometry. What we can also do as well is we can start working with a combination of these different maps. So if I drag this texture over to my bump well over here, make sure that you have the sync box checked. So these are really similar maps, so we'll want to make sure that's checked. And then since this is a normal map, just check normal map. Make sure those are synced. It doesn't look like these are synced correctly. Sorry about that. Oh no, they are. It has a line in the middle that I hadn't noticed before. But now you can see we're going to start getting a little bit more detail around that edge, and that's working with the combination of a bump map and an opacity map. So without that bump map, it's really sharp. Adding that bump map, in this case the normal map, we're getting a little bit more information on those edges as well. For those of you who are interested in creating your own normal maps, we'll go ahead and plug. There's a piece there. There are a lot of different ways to do it. There are some online websites where you can find normal maps. Again, I mentioned the KeyShot Cloud. That's coming. Hopefully, people are going to be uploading their normal maps there as well. There's the software I was going to mention is called Crazy Bump. It's available on Mac and PC. It will take any image and actually convert that into a normal map, which gives you a lot more control over your map. So that's just kind of a brief intro into those different types of maps. Specular map, we talked about the reflectivity. You can define how reflective material is not just off of a single color, but by using a map as well. And I'll talk a little bit more about that later. But let's change that back to glass. And one thing I want to mention briefly here as well. So if I turn off this outer piece of glass, you'll notice that I've got more objects under that piece of glass. When I turn my glass on, I can't actually see those. And sometimes, let's say you're working with glass or transparent materials and they're not lightening up, they're staying too dark and you don't necessarily know why. I want to make sure to call out that this has to do with your ray bounces in the scene. So what we're doing is we're basically bouncing around photons inside KeyShot. So we're bouncing around these light particles, and we can define how many times they actually bounce. So if you have this set to a low value, the light actually isn't bouncing enough times to get through all those layers of glass and then come back out at the camera. So if I put that down to a low value, something like 1, we're not even getting through the glass at all. but as I start to increase the number of ray bounces, you'll start to see that we get more definition on the inside of this lens assembly, because the ray bounces are now high enough to actually see through all of those layers of glass. So again, if you're working with a lot of transparent or translucent materials and they're darkening up and you're not sure why, try taking a look at your ray bounces. A word of caution, ray bounces are something that if you push this to a really high value, you can see I've gone up to 36. It's going to make no difference in the quality of my rendering at this point. All I've done is I've made it take longer to actually render. So you want to work with this one with a little bit of caution. So in this case, it looks like if I put the ray bounces at about, looks like 13, I can get 13 is a high enough value to get through that actual, all those layers of material, but it's not so high that it's going to slow down my rendering. So we've got some kind of base numbers that we work off of. The default is a lower one, but again, if you're not getting enough light on the inside of your transparent materials, then you can always up the ray bounces. There was a question about the if this is going to be available online. Yes, it will be. We've been recording this session, so it's going to be, if you do have to leave, or if this would be helpful to watch again, it's going to be available online at a later date. Okay, so if we toggle back and forth between performance and quality, you can see the difference there. So with performance mode on, it's turned those ray bounces down to 2. We know we need more ray bounces to actually see through all those layers, but this is when it's nice to be able to actually toggle into performance mode, because right now we don't really need to see in there, but when we get out of performance mode later, we know that we're going to be able to, if we have those ray bounces high enough, we're going to be able to see through all those materials. Since I had used that right click and look, you can see that when I rotate my real-time camera, it's rotating along this edge out here. And if I zoom, it's going to zoom in the wrong place. So I can always reset the camera rotation just by right-clicking and look at object center. Now it's going to be the center point for my actual geometry there. So let's rotate this around to the back, and I want to talk about illuminated displays, just because I know that's a pretty common look that people are going for. So the way this is set up here is I have a body, so I have this part here, and that's actually my glass, and behind it is going to be the actual display itself, right? So we've got some graphics that we want to apply. So what I can do is I'll go over here to my glass and just add a basic glass, right? So now you can see I've got that nice crisp highlight on my glass there, but I still want to put an illuminated display behind it. So I'll just select that piece of geometry, uncheck it so it's no longer visible, and I'll double click on this actual display here. And let's go ahead and turn that into an illuminated display. In order to do that, by default, it's going to be a diffuse material. I'm just going to change this to the emissive material type. We're not going to see too much of a difference here because we're in performance mode. So I'll uncheck performance mode, and then we're still not seeing a whole lot of difference, even though we've changed this material to a light emitting material. And that's because we don't have global and ground illumination turned on. So now if I go back to my environment tab, decrease my brightness in the scene, you'll see that some of that illumination a lot of that illumination, because my brightness is really low, is coming just from this emissive material. The reason we use the emissive material is because we can bring in a color texture. So if you're working with a display, you know, you've got like some sort of touch control or something like that, you can just bring over whatever your artwork is and apply that to the emissive material. In this case, I'll just drag that over as a color texture. And then now that's actually going to be emitting light through that image. So I'll just go ahead and scale that down a little bit so we can get that to match up. I'll turn off repeat just so it's not repeating. That also helps me match up the scale a little bit easier. And then I can use my mapping tool to put that into the correct place there. And it looks like it's reversed. So I'll just hit flip horizontal. And now if I turn down my environment brightness, you'll see that the actual lighting is going to be coming from this display, and it's going to have that correct lighting information. So let's turn on our ground reflections. So now you can see the reflection of that light coming through with a little bit of blue cast as well. We still have that piece of glass hidden, so I'll go ahead and turn on the display glass. Now the light's actually going to be shining through that glass as well, And if I turn up the brightness in my environment, it's a little bit tough to see here, but you can see that glass is catching the reflection of my environment. So that's we have a quick tip on the illuminated display, but I just wanted to mention that as well. That's how you can quickly create an illuminated display, and that's using the emissive material type. Okay. All right, let's add a little bit more texture onto the grip here on our camera because it's looking really, really dark. Again, we'll toggle into performance mode, Alt-P, just so it's a little bit faster to work with. There's a question about a knurled texture, and yes, that's how we can create a knurled texture using those image maps before. So again, here's just our shiny piece of plastic. So if I just type in knurl, drag that over to the part just like we did before. That's a normal map since it's that kind of purpley blue one. Check normal map. We'll bring that down to a smaller size, and then we can go into our colors and grab a color like this electric blue. And so now we have a knurled kind of texture. Get it out of performance mode, and then we can see that reflecting the light there. Great. So kind of a brief overview on the materials and textures. One other thing I want to mention briefly as well are labels. So we can always add a label to any material, and labels you should think of kind of like stickers. So for example, let's say we wanted to add a KeyShot logo, because this is a KeyShot camera, onto this part right here. What we could do is we can just grab, you can do this from your Finder or Windows Explorer, but I'll go into my labels, and here we have this KeyShot icon. So I can actually just drag that onto the material and add it as a label. Now if I double click on that part, you'll see under my labels tab that icon is showed up as a label. I can also scale that down here, right? So it's still going to be my shiny metal, and on top of that, actually it's a little bit rough, but on top of that I have this label which I've added on, and I can always change where it's actually placed using my position button here. So I'll go ahead and hit done, and now that label is going to be on that material there. You can add multiple labels as well. They do support transparency, so for example, this label is a PNG, and you can see it's been cut out. So if you want to add multiple labels, you can do that. You can layer them. You can make it look like a NASCAR or whatever you want, no problem. I also want to make sure to call out that, again, we have this specular, this mystical specular, right? So all labels come in diffuse. But if I change the specular value, so right now it's not reflecting any light, but if I change that to white, now you can see I'm actually getting a shiny label. So I'll change that back to black. You can see it's totally diffuse, right? Now when I change that to white, I'm getting that crisp highlight on that label. So you can always make your labels reflective just by changing that specular value. The labels are projected with normal projection, so however you apply them, they're going to try to wrap over your entire surface. But if you are working with different projection types, let's say we were going to try to put a label onto our soda can or our soda bottle, we could use this cylindrical projection type to do that. We're not going to cover that today. Again, there's a good quick tip for that. But labels you can always add to your materials, and it's just basically a way of doing printing or stickers or things like that. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about our environment. So we have about 50 environments in the KeyShot library. Again, we're going to be adding more to the KeyShot Cloud. That's going to be accessible in KeyShot 5. As well, there will be a web interface for the KeyShot Cloud, but it will require KeyShot 5. But whenever you add a different environment, and I just drag the exact same environment, but when you change out the environment, and I'll get it out of performance mode just so we can see that a little bit better, it's going to change the lighting in the scene, and that's going to affect the shadows and the reflections and things like that. So for example, if I put this into the old Luxion conference room, it's going to give me these a completely different lighting style based off of what this environment is. They're broken up by interior, outdoor, and studio. So for example, if you were doing like a vehicle or something that needs to be in an outdoor scenario, You can just drag an outdoor scene. Something that's also coming with KeyShot 5 Pro is going to be a sun and sky generator. So if that's important to you, that will be a pro feature in KeyShot 5. You can generate a sun and sky for whatever location on the planet at whatever time of day or year that you want to do, and have a lot more control over your lighting that way. But right now we'll just kind of focus on our studio environment. So as I drag those over, you'll see that this is gonna give me more of kind of a studio look, right? Much more controlled lighting environment. I'll turn my ground reflections off just so it's not as distracting. And I can put in performance mode as well, just so it's a little bit easier to see. You can always rotate your environments as well. So if I just hit the rotation tool here, it's going to change the way that the light is going to be cast onto that on my model. Model stays in the same place, but my environment is going to be rotated around that as well. There's a question about creating your own environment. So this is part of our Pro package, but if I hit the Edit HDR button, we can go in and actually adjust our environment. And I'll show you two ways of doing this. Well, one, we can adjust the environment. Two, we can create our own environment. What I'll do is I'll work with, let's say, this interior scene of this conference room, and I'll drag that over. And you can see it's a really busy environment. I also have a lot of light information. It's a really warm environment, and my reflections are a little bit distracting, right? So I can actually see the building reflected out of this window because of my environment. The HDR editor, which is a pro feature, will allow you to make adjustments. So for example, if I wanted to cut down on the saturation, I can just drag this slider to the left. Now I'm working off of less color information in my environment. So I don't have those same warm tones. I also have the ability to blur an environment. So if I drag this slider over, you'll see now my environment is getting blurred, because that's one question we get pretty often, like, oh, how do I hide the reflections on the chrome? Well, what you can do is you don't have to mess with the material at all. In this case, I'm just blurring the environment, and that way I don't have to actually change any of my material properties. One thing to know with KeyShot as well, this slider only goes from 0 to 1, but I could always type in a larger value. So now I've set that blur to 3. It's really blurring it out. But now I'm getting almost kind of studio lighting using an existing environment to create that. But these are some of the ways that you can make changes to the existing environments. So what about actually creating your own environments? I'm going to go over here and let's take a look at some of our studios. Again, if you're missing some of these simple gradients, run the KeyShot full installer instead of just the update installer, and you'll see these in your environment library as well. So if I drag a new environment over, after we made changes to that environment, we get this window asking us, what do you want to do with your environment that you made changes to? In this case, I'm going to hit Don't Save, but you can save those environments. We can add pin lights, so I can add a pin here, and that's just going to add a light to my scene. But the really cool thing we've added with KeyShot 4 is the ability to set a highlight. So let's say this is the camera angle that I want to use. I can just use the set highlight function. And you can see down here on the Mac, it's going to be command click. On Windows, it's control click. But now if I hold command, wherever I click is actually just going to add a highlight onto that model, because it's placing a pin based off the position of my camera. Now if I want to highlight on this chamfer here, just click, it's going to add that highlight, and here I'll just click one more time just to add the highlight there. What's nice about these is I can go in and I can tweak these lights as well, right? So I can turn these on and off as I need them. I can rename them. You can also make basic adjustments to them. So for example, that light is actually blowing out the chamfer. So what I can do is I can back down on the brightness, right? So now it's not going to be as bright. This light in the front, I think that was pin 3 that was giving our highlight here, right? I can change the shape, so change that from circular to rectangular. Now I can push that height up, and I can still move that light around in the scene. So now it's going to give me that nice crisp highlight on the front of my lens, right? And I can back down on that brightness as well. But you can use an environment editor to build up the lighting exactly how you want it for this particular camera view, right? We can also change the color, we can make it blend. We're also going to be adding some more different types of lights with KeyShot 5. Again, this is a pro feature, but if you get into environment creation, this is one of the easiest ways to do it. But I'll go ahead and close it out. So now we have our environment. I can just put this on a white background, and then we now have kind of our studio lighting, get it out of performance mode, and that one's ready to go, right? So this environment is pretty much set. It's good. What we can do is we can save this custom environment. So I'll go up to File, and then I'll just hit Save As, and I'll just drop this on the desktop, and we'll call it My Environment, if I could spell correctly, My Environment 1, and then just hit Save. So now it's going to save out our custom environment so that we can use that anytime we want. All right, so we've got our custom environment there. So what about when we start working with different camera angles? Because as soon as I change my camera here, it's going to change my lighting, right? So what I can do is I can save what's called the view set. So if I go to my camera tab here, I can use this drop down, and again, view sets are a pro feature, but I want to mention it to those of you who are pro users and may not know it's here. If I add a view set's going to be a combination of the camera settings and the actual environment settings as well. So if now if I change my camera here, let's look at our object center. We'll square this up. We'll put this into orthographic mode. And then I'm going to turn off my ground shadows as well. So this is going to be kind of the look that we're using for our line drawings. And then I'm just going to change this to a different environment. Right, so now I get a pretty different look. Right, so something like this. If I go to my camera tab, I can save out a new view set, and I'll call this view set 2, right? And just to illustrate this a little bit better, let's put this kind of into a busier environment. So let's go back to our conference room, drop that in, put it in perspective mode, go to my environment tab, make the lighting environment visible. And then now we want to save this camera with the environment settings. We'll add a third view set, and that's going to be view set 3. So now when I toggle back through my view sets, the view set's going to be the combination of my camera settings and all my environment settings as well. So now I toggle to view set 1, view set 2, which is a different environment, and now view set 3. So that's going to be, it is a pro feature, but that's one of the easiest ways to start managing all of your shots. Because what you can do at this point is save your camera angles with the custom environment to actually give you the best lighting for your highlights and your reflections and things like that, exactly where you want them. You can also, let's say this camera, I was going to be doing a couple different variations. I was doing a few different concepts. I could bring in all those different cameras and then go through my different view sets, and I can quickly generate a bunch of different concepts based off of that view set. But yeah, so view sets are really handy because they are that combination of the camera and the environments. Under your environments, you can always put it onto the lighting environment as a background here. A color, we can just add whatever color we want. Or you can always work with the backplate as well. So let's say let's change out our environment. So we'll put this into the office, make this office visible. And what we wanted to try to do is actually match, we wanted to render this camera into the office. What you're going to want to do is work with a combination of backplates and environments. So here are some images from this same office. So this desk, for example, let's try this one here. We'll drag that over. We'll set that as a backplate, so you can see I now have a backplate. My lighting environment is still there. I'm still getting all the reflections and lighting from this lighting environment. But now if I go back to that backplate, I can set it so that my camera is sitting on this table, and I'll toggle it back to my lighting environment, and I'll rotate my environment so it matches up. Looks like it's actually on the other side. I've got my light coming in this way. Now you can see in my reflection, I actually have that table because I'm working with the combination of the lighting environment with a matching backplate. So that's how you would start compositing this into a scene where you're actually trying to match the lighting in the background and things like that. Okay, so that's a little bit with some of the environment settings. And let's briefly talk about camera. We talked about the view sets. This interface is actually going to get updated in KeyShot 5 as well. So instead of a drop-down menu, it'll be a list. But you can do things, let's say we can go to a free camera, right? And what we can actually do is we can save this as a new view set. I'll call that view set 4. But you can always lock your camera, right? So If you're ever working and you don't want to accidentally bump the mouse and change your camera, now I don't know if you can hear me clicking, but I'm trying to click and no changes are being made. You can always lock the camera that way. One really good thing to know is that, I'll quickly go to my preferences, and I think it's under interface. There's this checkbox here for the Windows users. It's under Edit and Preferences, but if you include camera movements in the undo stack, now if you accidentally move the camera and you hit undo, it'll undo that camera movement. So if you don't have this checked, it's worth looking into, because I can't tell you how many times I did a rendering, accidentally moved the camera, and I had to update that rendering and I could never match that again. So yeah, if you have that checked, then you can always undo the camera movements there. So if I unlock that, I can go back in and make changes to it. For example, changing the mode between perspective and orthography. You can change the amount of perspective as well. This is when it's nice under the environment tab. If you check ground grid, you can actually project a grid in 3D so that you can help line this up, so that it's easier to actually match that to a backplate. To get it to actually be correct there. With KeyShot 5, we're working with automatic backplate perspective matching, so I won't focus on that now, but that's where that checkbox is if you ever need to use it. I'll put this back into a studio environment, so we'll go back to our view set 1. Briefly, I want to mention also depth of field. So depth of field, if I check that, you'll see everything is going to basically go blurry. But depth of field is going to create a little bit more realism because it's going to blur certain points of your model. So if you check depth of field, you need to hit this point of focus, because now wherever I click, it's actually going to put that spot into focus. I don't see a huge difference right now, but I'm focusing on this part, and now what I need to adjust is my f-stop. So the f-stop controls how much is actually in or out of focus. So if I put this down to a small value and we let that res up, you'll see that it's going to be a little bit blurrier back there. Let's drop that down to an even smaller value. Now you can see that a little bit better, that this is going to be blurry, whereas this area where I clicked is going to be in focus. You can always refocus as well, so if you just click this, and now I click down here on our bottom corner, then that's going to be in focus. And you can see this part of the camera here is a little bit fuzzy. It's important to note that if I change my camera, so now I'm zooming in, I'm actually moving the camera closer to my model here, so now it's out of focus again. So you just need to refocus. That's something to keep in mind. Your actual point of focus is dependent on the distance between the camera to your model. So if you do change your camera, you're going to have to rework your point of focus. So here you can see if I zoom way out, I've totally lost the focus, so I just have to refocus that again. Depth of field is something that does add on to your render time as well, so it will slow it down a little bit. We have a quick tip recorded for if you're using the Pro version and you want to use the depth pass, there is a way that you could quickly do realistic depth of field. It's not as good if you were to do it in KeyShot, but you can do it in Photoshop or through post-processing. Okay. The last material type I want to mention, I know this is jumping around a little bit, but I want to make sure that we cover it. I'm going to right click this model and I'm going to duplicate it, and I'm going to turn off the original. If you don't know that this material is there, I just want to make sure. I'd say it's a pretty essential tool. But I could right click this entire assembly. Then under my material, I can change the material type for this whole model. And what I'm just going to do is I'm just going to change that to the Toon material. If you don't know that you have the possibility of working with the Toon material, I just want to make sure that that's something that's on your radar. I'll put it in performance mode. But now you can see that this is actually going to be kind of a cartoon appearance, right? So if you want to work with line drawings or exploded views, instruction manuals, patent drawings, now if I double click on a material, I can work with a lot of different variables, like the actual color of that material itself, the outline color. I can change the contour angle, so how many lines are actually visible there. There's a transparency slider, which is pretty handy, right? So if you want to do some kind of illustrated cutaway views, it's important also to know that your textures and labels are still going to stay there. So our blue material here, if I go under the advanced material and I turn on my environment shadows and get out of performance mode so I actually see that, you can see that I still have that knurled texture that we made before. But Toon is just a different material type, so I'll drop the transparency on that, but I do want to make sure that you know that the Toon material is an option for you. But what's cool about it is you can work with a Toon just as a different material. So let's say these buttons, I wanted to turn these back to chrome. It's just a different material type that you can work with inside KeyShot. So that's all. I'm not going to get too much into the Toon material, but just so you know it's there, Toon is a really easy way of making line drawings, artwork, things like that. Okay, so we'll go back to our photorealistic camera, and for those of you who are following what I did, I just duplicated it. So now I have two instances of these camera. One that's kind of the cartoon version, and one that's with our full kind of photorealistic version. Okay, the last thing I want to talk about here are going to be some of the render settings. So in this case, we're not going to get into animation in VR, but what about actual render output, right? So we've got a couple different file formats that we could render to. Let's say we're not working with a full-on rendering that's got to go to print or anything like that. I'm just rotating my environment, holding down Command on the Mac and be Control on the Windows side. But if we let this sit here just for a couple of seconds, you can always hit the screenshot button, and that'll save out a screenshot of whatever is on screen. In this case, it's going to pop up and ask me, and I'll call this my camera 1, and I'll save that just as a PNG, right? So I can always go back and just have these screenshots. But let's say you don't need these to be super high quality renderings. That's good enough for the presentation that you're working with. You can always save a screenshot. But what about rendering, you know, something really large, or it's got to be really, really high quality? We're going to briefly talk about the quality settings for rendering. So you can output a couple of different types of formats. So for example, the PNG or TIFF do support transparency, so you can include the alpha for easier compositing. You can type in whatever resolution you want. We've got some presets here. You can also, let's say we wanted to do an 8x5 inch print or something like that. Whoops, our format is a little bit different. So let's put 5 by 3. You can set the DPI here, and it'll do the math for you to make sure that you're getting whatever image you're going for. Okay, so quality. Just briefly, I want to talk about the quality settings. So we've got 3 different options for quality. Max time and max samples are going to be using basically your real-time settings that you see here in your real-time window. So if after 10 seconds this rendering looks okay, and you just want to re-render it, let's say with the PNG so that it's got alpha channel, you can always just you can hit 10 seconds and then save that out, and when I hit render, it's just going to render that for 10 seconds and it's going to give me the best image it can in 10 seconds. And it will use whatever settings you've got. So for example, our shadows, illumination, ray bounces, whatever you have here that's going on in your real-time view under your real-time settings. Maximum samples is pretty similar. It's using the real-time render that you see here to give the max number of samples for every pixel on the screen. So the number of samples, the lower you set this, the lower the sample count is going to be, a little bit lower quality. The higher samples you work with, it's going to be higher quality. I tend to work a lot of the time with advanced control because this does give you a lot more fine control here, and it lets you get repeatability with renderings, which is pretty important. This is especially important for things like doing an animation or a VR where, let's say if you're rotating the model and it doesn't look exactly the same from one frame to the next, using max time or max samples. In this case, that's something I would try using like your advanced control to give you a little bit more control on all those render settings. So our samples here, we've got, as you can see, with these settings here, we've got some defaults. For example, our ray bounces has been updated because it pulled whatever we put in from our ray bounces from our real-time view. Some good numbers to stick with for samples. I usually tend to go no more than 32 for my samples. Usually 24 to 32 is pretty good for samples. Ray bounces, again, I mentioned before, if you crank this up really high, you're not actually making that rendering look any better. So the ray bounces, I'd try to get right in my real-time view, but you know, I don't normally exceed like 10 ray bounces unless I'm working with a lot of clear, translucent, transparent materials, things like that. The rest of these I tend to keep mostly at the default settings, the notable exception being depth of field. Depth of field is one where if you are using the depth of field, I would push that up to a value of about 3, at least 3, maybe more, depending on what you're looking for. But for the most part, the changes I make to the rendering are mostly going to be just with my samples and ray bounces, and then on top of that, it's just going to be it's going in and working with the materials on the material basis, just to try to get the particular look that I'm going with for the material itself. There's a question in here about caustics. Caustics are enabled. I can't move that slider because we don't have caustics enabled. What caustics actually are, caustics are going to be when you can see this checkbox here. I'm not going to work with an example here, but caustics are when let's say you've got a glass with some liquid on it on a table, and as the light actually goes through that liquid, it changes the appearance of that material. Let me actually, I'll pull up a quick example of that, just because I know I've got some. Give me 2 seconds and I'll bring that up. So this is a lot of content that's coming from some of our users. So let's take a look at our caustics here. So in this case here, let's get one that shows that a little bit better. Caustics are light actually transmitting, and credit for this goes to Dries, who put this image together. He actually shared it on our forums. It's when light actually goes through a material and gets changed in its color and the way it's refracted and reflected and things like that. But when you do that, I would recommend working with an actual light emitting material in your scene. That's going to give you the best results for caustics until we release the Sun and Sky Simulator with KeyShot 5. That's going to be another good way of generating some really nice looking caustics in the scene. There's a question about pixel blur. So the image necessarily, and I'll show you where that question is coming from. Under quality, it's this pixel blur. This is the default amount of blur that actually gets output from KeyShot. Excuse me, the question is about whether a lower value will make the image sharper. In some cases it will. That's one thing I tend to keep this at the default setting. The reason being that any image that comes out of KeyShot, if you don't have any blur, any pixel blur at all, it looks a little bit too crisp and a little bit too computer generated. So a small amount of blur will help add a little bit of realism. So I tend to keep that at the default value. If that's something you want to adjust, you can set that to 1, and you can always work with a little bit of pixel blur inside Photoshop or GIMP after the fact if you want to do that. However, I just recommend keeping it at the default value of a 1.5. Really quick, the only other material that I do want to mention, make sure that I call this out. I'm going to try to wrap up in the next couple minutes, but is our light emitting material. So we quickly touched on the emissive material type that we use for our display back here. But what I want to talk about are light materials that we do have in KeyShot. So I'm going to just import, and I'm just going to import a simple model. Let's find a sphere, and I'm going to add that to this scene here. So you can see I have this sphere, which is added to my scene. It's really tiny. So let's bump up the scale on that. And I'm going to use my move tool to position that above my camera here. And sorry, I forgot about this, but I just want to make sure I do cover it. So now we have this sphere that's sitting here above our camera. So let's say we want to actually turn that into a light. You can assign light as a material to any piece of geometry in your scene here. So if I double click on that, I'll change that from diffuse to an area light diffuse. You're going to see that this is a super bright light, and the reason being is that it's a 100-watt area light diffuse, and because I have my unit set to millimeters, it's just a couple of millimeters away from my camera. So if you ever have a scenario where you're working with lights and your lights are really blown out, or they're really dark and you can't figure out why, under edit you can always change your model unit. So I can change this from millimeter, we'll change that to inches. Now that light's going to be a whole lot softer. So now if I crank up that power, actually I'll make that white, and I bump up that illumination. Now we're getting some illumination. It's really soft illumination coming from this area light diffuse. So if you're ever working with LEDs or any lights in your scene, you can use the light materials for that. One is the area light diffuse. What it does is it takes all the surface of any part and actually makes that into a light emitting material. It's nice because I can turn off visible to camera, invisible in reflections, and all we're going to get is that little bit of extra light on top that's going to give us these soft shadows. We also have a point light diffuse. If I crank up the power on this, you'll see that what it's doing, it's finding the center point of that geometry and emitting light just from a single point. So now our shadow is going to be much more defined. And if I use my move tool and move that around, you'll see I have a really crisp shadow, and that's because I'm using that point light. So that's just going to be a single point of light that's emitting there, in this case just some white light. And just like any other materials, you can assign color values to these as well. So if you want to add a little bit of tonality into your lights and things, you can do that. But brief intro, I'm not going to cover it here, we do respect IES profiles. So if you want to bring in pre-made lighting profiles to work with inside KeyShot, you can do that as well. And let me just go back to this. Let's go back to view set 1. And I'm just going to turn off that extra lighting sphere that we added. And I think that's mostly it for some of the questions that I'm going to be able to answer today. Anything else that I didn't get to, as far as additional resources, you can always go back. This webinar is going to be available on our website. We also have video tutorials and quick tips. Video tutorials are nice because the tutorials go through basically step-by-step working with KeyShot. The quick tips are a great resource because it's one specific tip on one particular thing. For example, working with the labels on a transparent material. So, like that example of adding a label to a soda bottle. That's one great resource. Again, you can always find more of our webinars. We do these once a month, so we always include the webinars as something that you can either watch or download later. And additionally, you can always check out our forum. Our forum has a lot of great information there. There are a lot of really, really helpful users. So if you have a question or if you're ever trying to get a particular look, you can always take a look on our forum because there is a lot of good information there. But otherwise, I think that's going to be it for me today. Josh, do you think there's anything else that I need to cover?
That's it. Very good. Thanks everyone for joining us today. We'll see you next time.
All right. Well, thank you.